Snow does not fall gently in the mountains of Raven Hollow. It comes sideways, like a wall of broken glass, cutting through armor, tearing at skin, howling through every crack in stone like something wild that has never learned to be still. King Brian of Silver Ridge had seen 1,000 storms in his 34 years of living. He had crossed frozen rivers with his boots soaking through. He had buried men in ground so hard the shovels cracked before the graves were deep enough. He had survived siege, ambush, famine, and betrayal. He thought he had seen everything a war could offer. He was wrong. The army moved through the mountain pass like a river of iron and exhaustion. Nearly 1,000 soldiers, their armor dented, their faces hollowed by months of fighting, pressed forward in silence. Boots crushed ice. Horses steamed in the cold. Torches guttered and swayed in the wind. Nobody spoke because nobody had the strength left for words. They were done. The northern campaign against the rogue factions of the Hollow Range had lasted 3 months longer than anyone expected. 3 months of blood, cold ground, and meals that tasted like ash. King Brian rode at the front on his great white dire wolf, Frost. A beast so massive that soldiers gave it 10 feet of space on either side without being asked. Commander Lewis rode to his left, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, his face a history of scars and bad decisions. Captain Gary rode to his right, spine straight despite his exhaustion, sharp eyes moving constantly across the shadows in the tree-line. They were close to home. Another day, maybe 2, and they would be through the pass and descending toward Silver Ridge. Toward warmth. Toward beds that were not frozen ground. Brian was thinking about his hearth when Frost stopped. The great wolf planted all 4 paws and refused to move. Easy, Brian murmured, pressing a hand to the wolf's thick neck. What is it? Frost's ears pinned back. A low sound built in his chest. Not quite a growl. Not quite a warning. Something caught between the two. Then Brian smelled it. Rogue wolves. Dozens of them, by the thickness of the scent. And something else underneath it. Something sharp, clean, and entirely out of place in the ruins ahead. Hold, Brian said quietly. The army behind him stopped like a single organism. 1,000 men going still at once. Even the horses seemed to understand. Captain Gary leaned forward in his saddle. His eyes, sharper than most, had already found it. Sire. The Raven Hollow courtyard. Look, Brian looked. And for the first time in 20 years, the King of Silver Ridge felt his breath leave his body not from cold or exhaustion, but from something he could not immediately name. In the center of the crumbling courtyard, surrounded on all sides by rogue wolves, he counted quickly. 16, 17, 18, stood a single figure. She was not large, not armored, not backed against any wall or sheltered by any ruin. She stood in the open, in a deep crimson dress now torn at the hem and soaked dark with blood, whether hers or theirs, he could not yet tell. A white cloak, weathered to the color of old bone, whipped behind her in the wind. Dark brown hair flew across her face, and she did not push it away. Her arms were extended, one to each side, and in each hand she held a single silver dagger. She was bleeding from her left arm. A clean slice, already drying in the cold. She was not trembling. She was watching the wolves the way a woman might watch strangers who had wandered into her kitchen uninvited. One of the soldiers near the front laughed. It started small, a short, disbelieving sound. Then it spread down the line the way laughter does when people are tired and something is absurd enough to break the tension. Even Brian shook his head. An Omega, out here alone, surrounded by rogue wolves, standing in the snow with 2 daggers she should not know how to use. Every law of nature, every truth he had been raised to understand about the world's order, said this woman was about to die. He was already reaching for the command to charge, already forming the words that would send his men down the slope to save her. He never got to say them. The largest rogue lunged. It was a massive animal, 140 pounds of muscle and hunger, jaws wide, moving at full speed toward her throat. She stepped sideways. One smooth, unhurried step, like she had rehearsed it. The wolf's jaws snapped shut on empty air. Her right hand moved. The dagger found the space between tendon and bone with the precision of someone who had done this before, not in anger, not in panic, but with the calm efficiency of a woman doing necessary work. The wolf fell. The laughter stopped. A second wolf charged from her left. She turned, and the movement was almost graceful, the cloak spinning out behind her like a wing. and the second dagger met the animal mid-stride. A third rushed her from behind. Without looking back, she kicked. Her heel connected with its jaw hard enough that the sound carried up the slope to where Brian sat on Frost. The wolf stumbled. She finished it in 2 more moves. Not a single soldier moved. Not a single word was said. 1,000 battle-hardened men stood on a frozen hillside and watched an Omega dismantle a pack of rogue wolves with 2 daggers and no visible fear, and not one of them could find their voice. Brian watched her work. That was the only word for it. Work. Not survival. Not desperation. She was not fighting to stay alive the way a cornered animal fights. She was methodical. She was precise. She was managing the wolves the way Lewis managed soldiers, reading the field, choosing her moments, spending as little energy as possible to achieve the result she wanted. And she was doing it while keeping herself between the wolves and something behind her. Something she would not let them reach. Something she was willing to take every one of these bites and cuts to keep safe. Brian narrowed his eyes. Behind her, barely visible through the swirl of snow and violence, was the dark opening of a collapsed archway. And within that darkness, something small shifted. Something that breathed. Whatever it was worth dying for. To her, at least. And suddenly, watching her plant her feet again as 4 more wolves circled, King Brian of Silver Ridge, a man who had laughed 60 seconds ago, found that he could not look away. Brian gave the command, and his men descended into the courtyard quietly, flanking the remaining wolves before the animals could decide whether to run or regroup. Most ran. 3 did not, and those 3 were handled quickly by Lewis, who had the look of a man who had been waiting for something to hit. The battle, if you could call it that, was over in under 2 minutes. When the last wolf disappeared into the tree line, the courtyard went quiet except for the wind and the distant sound of Ethan shifting behind the archway. Brian dismounted. He walked toward her slowly, the way you approach something you are not entirely sure you understand yet. She was already standing still, both daggers held down at her sides, watching him come. She was breathing hard, not from fear, he noted, but from exertion. Her left arm was bleeding properly now. The cut was long but not deep. She had not looked at it once. Up close, she was younger than she had looked from the hillside. Early 20s, he guessed. Ice blue eyes that held nothing soft in them. Not hostility, not relief, just a steady, measuring attention that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the way his most experienced field commanders looked at new terrain. Her chin lifted slightly as he stopped in front of her. Brian said the first thing that came to him. "You're bleeding." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I noticed." Lewis appeared at Brian's shoulder and made a sound that was almost a laugh. Gary materialized on the other side, quiet as always, already scanning the ruins. "Who are you?" Brian asked. "Elara," she said. "Nobody important." "Nobody important just held off 18 rogue wolves." 19, she corrected, without any particular pride in it. "One came from the east side. Your men didn't see it." Brian studied her. He had spent 34 years learning to read people. It was one of the few useful things his father had passed on before passing away. He was good at it. He could look at a man and know within a minute whether the man was lying, whether he was afraid, whether his loyalty would hold under pressure. He looked at Elara and could not immediately read her. That, in his experience, was either very good or very dangerous. Usually both. Gary had already moved toward the archway. He crouched at the entrance, peered inside, and then went very still. Brian watched him. Gary's reactions were small and controlled. The man was not one for visible emotion, which was why, when he slowly turned around and looked at his king with an expression that could only be described as quietly stunned, Brian felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the weather. "Sire," Gary said, "you need to come and see this." Elara moved first, stepping forward quickly, positioning herself between Brian and the archway without quite touching him. It was automatic. Protective. Like a mother wolf moving to cover her pup. Brian raised a hand gently. "Easy," he said. "I'm not going to hurt whatever is in there." "You don't know that yet," she said. And her voice was quiet, but absolutely firm. "Then I'll say it again," he said. "I give you my word as King of Silver Ridge. Whatever is behind you, I mean it no harm." She held his gaze for a long moment. He did not look away, because men who intend harm generally cannot hold that kind of eye contact without flinching. Elara stepped aside. Brian ducked through the archway. The space inside was small, a collapsed antechamber, the roof half gone, enough shelter from the wind to make it 10 degrees warmer than outside. The floor was covered in old cloth, carefully arranged. There were the remains of a small fire, not recently lit. A bundle of dried herbs hung from a jutting stone. A waterskin. 2 pairs of small boots, worn at the toes. And in the far corner, wrapped in an old wool blanket the color of storm clouds, a boy sat with his knees pulled to his chest. He was perhaps 9 or 10 years old. Dark chestnut hair, unwashed and tangled. Blue-gray eyes that were watching Brian with the careful attention of a child who has learned that strangers are a calculation, not a comfort. Thin, too thin. The kind of thin that takes years, not weeks. But upright. Alert. Not crying. He did not cower. Brian looked at the boy for a long moment. Something pulled at the back of his mind. Some old memory, some portrait on a wall in the Royal Gallery he had walked past 100 times without stopping to study. Then the boy turned his head slightly, and the firelight caught the angle of his jaw, and Brian's world tilted. He knew that jaw. He knew it because it was the same jaw that appeared on every formal portrait of the royal line of Silver Ridge going back 4 generations. He knew it because it was, in a younger form, the jaw of his own late brother, Prince Aldrich. Brian's voice came out very quietly. "What is your name?" The boy looked at Elara first, a quick, checking glance, asking permission without words. She gave him a small nod. The boy looked back at Brian. "Ethan," he said. "Prince Ethan, of Silver Ridge." The silence that followed was complete. Outside, the wind continued its indifferent howling. Somewhere in the courtyard, Louis was issuing instructions in his usual volume. Frost paced. Inside, in the dim cold shelter of a ruined 6 hours from the kingdom, the king of Silver Ridge stood looking at the nephew who had been declared dead 6 years ago. Ethan was alive, and the woman with the silver daggers and the ice-blue eyes had kept him that way. They made camp inside the ruins that night. It was not wise to push through the mountain pass in darkness, and even Brian could see that both Elara and Ethan needed rest before they could travel. Louis organized the soldiers with the efficiency of a man who had been doing exactly this for 30 years. Tents went up, fires were lit in sheltered corners, food was distributed. The men asked no questions about the boy. Louis had communicated through eyebrows alone that questions were not currently welcome. Gary sat with Ethan near the warmest fire, feeding the boy 3 portions of trail rations without comment, and Ethan ate all of it with the focused intensity of someone who has learned never to leave food unfinished. Brian found Elara sitting alone on a broken section of wall on the east side of the courtyard, her back to the camp, her arm now bandaged with strips of cloth she had produced from somewhere inside her cloak. He sat beside her without asking. She did not tell him to leave, which he took as agreement. For a moment neither of them said anything. The wind had dropped. The sky above the broken walls was clear now, full of stars. "How long?" Brian asked. 6 years, she said. "Since I found him. He was 4 years old, hiding in a cellar outside Raven Crossing. After the attack on the royal convoy." Yes, the attack on the royal convoy. Brian remembered the night the news arrived at the palace. His brother Aldrich and sister-in-law Mara, traveling north with their household for the winter gathering. Ambushed in the forest pass. No survivors found. The child's body never recovered, which the court had attributed to rogue wolves. He had grieved a nephew he never got to know. He said nothing about that now. "Why didn't you bring him to the palace?" She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, she chose her words carefully, the way someone does when they are sharing something true and want to get it exactly right. "Because someone arranged that attack. It was not random, and it was not rogues acting alone. Someone wanted Ethan dead. I had no way of knowing who. I had no way of knowing if bringing him to the palace meant bringing him to the people who paid for his parents' deaths." Brian sat with that. It was not an unreasonable conclusion. He did not want it to be true, but the parts of him that were not a king's pride acknowledged that it was not unreasonable. "You've been out here 6 years. Alone. Protecting him." "Not always alone," she said. "We had a few safe houses. A network of sorts. People who owed me favors." "What kind of person has a network?" "The kind who needed one." He looked at her. She was staring at the stars with the expression of someone who has a great deal more to say and has decided, for now, to say none of it. "The Ironwood Syndicate," he said. She didn't move, but something around her eyes shifted. "You know about them," she said. Not a question. We've been trying to locate their leadership for years. They run missing persons, contract work, underground trade routes. He paused. They were hired 6 years ago to find the missing royal child. Yes, she said simply. You were working for them. I was. And when you found Ethan, I made a different choice, she said. The 3 words sat between them. Brian turned to look at her directly. She was still looking at the sky. She had been hired to deliver a child to people who wanted him dead. She had found the child. And instead of doing the thing she had been paid to do, she had spent 6 years in the wilderness, alone, protecting him. He had spent the last 6 years in a palace, ruling a kingdom, never suspecting that somewhere in the mountain ruins, a woman who owed him nothing was keeping his bloodline alive. He did not have words for the size of what she had done. He settled for what he could manage. Thank you, he said. She glanced at him. A quick, almost surprised look, as if gratitude was something she did not quite know where to put. Don't thank me yet, she said. Whoever wanted him dead 6 years ago has not disappeared. Bringing him back to Silver Ridge means walking him directly toward whatever is waiting. Then we make sure we know what's waiting before we arrive. And if we don't know in time, then, Brian said, we make sure he's surrounded by 1,000 people who know how to fight. She looked at him for a longer moment this time. Something in her expression shifted, not quite trust, but the edge of it. The place where trust begins before it knows what it is yet. He's frightened, she said quietly. He doesn't show it, but he is. He's been frightened for 6 years. He's had nightmares every night since I found him. He cannot sleep without a light nearby. If you move through the palace too fast, if you put him in a room with too many unfamiliar faces at once, he shuts down completely. She paused. I'm telling you this because you need to know how to handle him. Not because I expect you to care. I care, Brian said. She studied him. You don't know him. He's my nephew. Knowing his name and knowing him are 2 very different things, she said. He hates being called Your Highness. He prefers Ethan. He reads everything he can find. He has strong opinions about everything, including opinions about things he's never seen. He is funnier than anyone expects, and he is stubborn in a way that could stop a river. She stopped, and something passed across her face too quickly to name. He learned how to cook over an open fire when he was 7. He can set a snare trap. He knows 3 survival knots, and he taught himself the 4th from a diagram in a book I found in a ruin. He is the bravest person I have ever known, and he is 10 years old. Brian was quiet. She had not intended that to come out the way it did. He could see that. She had meant to give him information. Instead, she had revealed everything she felt, in a single unguarded minute, without meaning to. She cleared her throat and looked back at the sky. That's all, she said a little stiffly. That's everything, he said. And I'm grateful you told me. She said nothing. But she did not move away. On the second morning of travel, when the army was 3 hours from the mountain pass and Ethan had fallen asleep against Elara's side in the supply wagon, Gary rode alongside Brian and spoke in the low, measured voice he reserved for things that mattered. I did some quiet thinking overnight, Gary said. Quiet thinking. Lewis called from behind them, apparently not as far away as he had seemed. Is that what you call sitting up by yourself counting stars? Go back to your marching, Lewis, Gary said, without turning his head. I am marching. I just have very long ears. Brian raised a hand. Lewis fell back. Tell me, Brian said to Gary. The attack on the royal convoy 6 years ago was attributed to the rogue faction from the Hollow Range, Gary said. But the timing always troubled me. The route Prince Aldrich took that night was not public knowledge. It was communicated through royal dispatch only, which means it was known only to palace staff, senior military, and the advisory council. Brian kept his eyes on the road. Someone on the inside gave the route to the rogues, Brian said. Or to whoever hired them, Gary said. I also want to note that in the 6 years since the attack, every formal inquiry into the convoy's destruction has been quietly concluded. Fast. Too fast, in my opinion. Without full evidence review. Who chaired those inquiries? Gary was quiet for a beat. Chancellor Kendrick, he said. All 3 of them. The names sat in the air between them. Chancellor Kendrick. 56 years old. 22 years in royal service. 3 kings served, of which Brian was the latest. Impeccably dressed, unfailingly gracious, extraordinarily well-connected. The kind of man who remembered every name, every birthday, every useful detail about every person of consequence in Silver Ridge. Also the kind of man who had inserted himself into every sensitive investigation of the last 2 decades and walked out of each one with the inquiry closed and his reputation intact. Brian said nothing. He filed it away in the part of him that would think about it properly once they were home. Ethan woke when the wagon hit a rut in the road. He sat up, looked around with the instant alertness of someone who learned at age for that not waking up fully could be fatal, and then settled when he saw Elara beside him. She was awake. She was always awake. "Are we close?" Ethan asked. "A few hours," she said. He nodded. He looked out at the mountains and then at the long river of soldiers ahead and behind, and his expression was the careful, measuring look of someone doing complicated math in their head. "I don't remember it," he said. "Silver Ridge. I was 4. I remember the ceiling of the cellar. I remember the cold. I remember a woman's voice. I think it was my mother's, telling me to stay, to not make a sound. And then she was gone." Elara did not try to fix it. That was one of the things Brian had already noticed about her. She did not rush to fill silence with comfort that wasn't ready yet. "You'll remember it going forward," she said. "Will you be there?" he asked. A pause. "For a while," she said. Ethan looked at her. "That's not a real answer." "I know," she said. He accepted that. He leaned his shoulder against hers and watched the mountains. Brian, riding nearby, heard all of it. He filed that away too. Silver Ridge received them the way a kingdom receives news it cannot immediately process. The gates opened. The streets filled. People crowded rooftops and leaned from windows and pressed against the roadside barriers, initially cheering for the returning army, and then falling into a peculiar, charged silence as word passed through the crowd like water finding its level. The prince was alive. The prince was alive, and he had been brought home by a lone woman and 1,000 soldiers who had been somewhere else entirely and stumbled into a miracle. A letter appeared, and signed, circulating among the nobles. It raised doubts. The boy had been gone 6 years, undocumented. There was no independent verification of his identity beyond the king's word. Was it not possible that the Omega woman, whose history with the Ironwood Syndicate was, by now, known to enough people to be a problem, had produced a child of convenient background for reasons of her own? Elara received a copy of the letter anonymously. She read it, set it flat on the table, and called for Gary. "This is coordinated," she told him. "Yes," Gary said. "The phrasing. It doesn't read like noble gossip. It reads like a brief. Someone wrote it for maximum political damage and minimum attribution." "Yes," Gary said again. "Someone with political experience. Someone who knows exactly which anxieties to press on and in what order." Gary nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. Elara brought it to Brian. She laid the letter on his desk without preamble. He read it. His jaw was very tight by the time he finished. "Who gave this to you?" "Someone who wanted me to see it." "The question isn't who gave it to me. It's who wrote it." He looked up at her. "Gary has a theory," she said. "So do I," Brian said. "And I've been sitting on it for 2 weeks waiting for something concrete." "Kendrick." "Kendrick," he confirmed. She pulled up a chair across from him, not waiting to be invited, which he had stopped noticing because it no longer surprised him, and leaned forward. He chaired all 3 post-convoy inquiries. "Yes." He was on the advisory council when the route was issued. "Yes." And in 6 years, no one in this palace has thought to press him on any of this. "He is very good," Brian said, "at being exactly the right person in the room. Until you're looking for the person who made the room." Brian studied her. She was sharp. He had known that from the first night, from the way she described the wolves' positions without even thinking about it, the way she filed and retrieved details with the ease of someone who survived by never missing anything. But it was more than instinct. She thought in structures. She thought the way Gary thought, in connections, in patterns, in the shape of things that should be there, but weren't. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he asked. Something flickered in her face. "The Ironwood Syndicate is an excellent education," she said, "in understanding how people hide what they don't want found." A pause. "I left them for a reason," she added. "More than one reason." "Tell me," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and the measured, careful quality of her attention was there as always. But something was different about it tonight. Something that was not quite calculation. "Later," she said, "when we've dealt with Kendrick. There is an order to these things." "Is there?" "There should be," she said, "or everything becomes chaos and nothing gets done." He almost smiled. She noticed. She pretended not to. But he noticed that too. Gary was, by his own assessment, a very boring man. He liked lists. He liked organized files. He liked the kind of satisfaction that comes from cross-referencing two documents and finding the thing that doesn't match. He had no romantic entanglements, no expensive habits, and no interesting flaws. What he had was patience. He spent 4 days in the palace archive. The archive was technically public, accessible to any senior palace official. What made it useful was that it was also boring enough that almost no one ever visited, which meant the records were honest. Nobody bothers falsifying documents nobody reads. Nobody except Kendrick, who had apparently falsified several. But not quite completely. Gary found the first gap on day 2, a series of military dispatch records from 6 years ago, around the date of the convoy attack, that referenced a classified royal directive he had never seen mentioned anywhere else. The directive itself was missing. Its reference number appeared in 4 separate documents, and then simply stopped. He found the second gap on day 3, a record of payment to a private security contractor, approved by the Chancellor's office, 2 weeks before the convoy attack, for a service described only as Northern Route Assessment. The contractor's name had been manually redacted, but the payment authorization code had not been. Gary spent the entirety of day 4 tracing that code through 3 separate financial registries, and at the end of it he sat back in the archive's single chair and looked at the ceiling and said, very quietly, a single word that he did not typically use. Then he collected his notes and went to find Lewis. "How bad?" Lewis asked, when Gary spread the documents on the table between them. "Significantly bad," Gary said. "Kendrick authorized a payment to a contractor who, based on the code, traces back through 2 intermediaries to a company that I can prove was the operational front for the Ironwood Syndicate's northern operations." Lewis stared at him. "He paid the syndicate. He paid someone who paid the syndicate," Gary said. 2 layers of separation. Professionally done. But traceable. "If you're patient," Gary said. "Yes." Lewis picked up one of the documents and read it, which took slightly longer than it would have taken Gary, because Lewis read the way he did everything, with full commitment and absolute disregard for speed. "So Kendrick hired the syndicate to carry out the attack," Lewis said slowly. "Which means he also knew that the syndicate had been hired to find Ethan. Which means he has known, this entire time, that somewhere out there the boy might still be alive. And he has spent 6 years ensuring that no investigation ever ran long enough or deep enough to find him." Lewis set the document down. "Why?" Lewis said. "Why does he want the boy dead?" "That," Gary said, "I believe we will find out at the Winter Assembly. He will not let Ethan officially reclaim his title without making a move. The question is what kind. Then we make sure we're ready for it," Lewis said. "That is the plan," Gary said. "Do you have a plan?" "I have the beginning of one." Lewis looked at him. "Is it a good beginning?" "It is a careful beginning," Gary said. "Those tend to be better," Lewis agreed. The Winter Assembly of Silver Ridge was the kingdom's oldest political institution, a formal gathering of nobles, military commanders, and royal advisors held at the solstice each year, inside the Grand Hall, to address kingdom-wide matters of significance. This year's agenda, circulated by the Chancellor's office 2 days before the event, contained one item above all others: the formal recognition of Prince Ethan as the living heir to the Silver Ridge throne. 300 people filled the Grand Hall. Torches lined the walls in their iron brackets. The long stone floor was covered in banners, the silver wolf of the royal house and the deep blue of the advisory council and the black and gold of the military. Musicians played in the gallery above. It should have been celebratory. Brian sat on the throne and watched Kendrick and felt, very clearly, that it was not going to be. Ethan entered the hall quietly, dressed in royal clothing for the first time in 6 years, and he looked, Brian thought, like someone wearing a borrowed skin and refusing to show it. Which was exactly what Elara had done for him, Brian suspected. Taught him how to wear the things that didn't quite fit yet without letting the room see the seams. Elara stood to the left of the royal dais, near Gary and Lewis, in a position that was neither servant nor official, just present. Brian had offered her a formal seat. She had declined without explanation, which he now understood meant she wanted to be able to move freely. She had known something was coming. He should have listened more carefully to that. Ethan stood before the assembly and produced the royal medallion from around his neck, The Silver Ridge seal, the real one, with its specific engravings that no forgery had ever replicated correctly, which had been around his neck since the night of the attack, placed there by his mother in the last minutes before she sent him to hide. He also produced documents. Letters in his mother's handwriting, sealed. A record of his birthmarks, which palace physicians confirmed within the hour matched their records exactly. He stood before 300 people, and he did not shake. He was 10 years old, and he did not shake. "My name is Ethan," he said, in a voice that was smaller than the hall, but carried clearly to every corner of it. "I am the son of Prince Aldrich and Princess Mara of Silver Ridge. I have been alive for the past 6 years. I would like to come home now." The hall erupted. Applause mostly. Some voices raised in what sounded like joy, and others in what was clearly not. And then, from the left side of the hall, a door opened. 12 men entered in palace guard uniforms. Brian recognized none of them. It happened fast. The 12 false guards spread through the room with the practiced efficiency of people who had rehearsed it. 3 moved toward the throne. 3 moved toward Ethan. The rest positioned at the exits. Kendrick stood from his seat at the advisory table. His face was exactly as it always was, calm, pleasant, utterly in control. "I am sorry for the disruption," he said, to the hall in general, in the voice of a man managing an inconvenience. "But there are some questions about the authenticity of the child's documents that require immediate investigation. For the protection of the throne, the boy must be taken into protective custody while." That was as far as he got. Lewis moved. Commander Lewis, who many people underestimated because he was large and had a blunt face and spoke in full volume at all times, was actually among the fastest men in the kingdom when he needed to be. He covered the distance between his position and the nearest false guard in 2 seconds and communicated his objection to the situation in a manner that required no words. Gary had already whistled, a short, specific sound, and from 3 separate doors, loyal soldiers poured in. 60 of them, prepositioned. Because Gary had a careful beginning to his plan, and the middle and end were equally careful. The grand hall became chaos. Real guards against false guards. Nobles scrambling for the exits or pressing against the walls. Torches guttering from the movement of bodies. Shouting everywhere. Brian was off the throne in a moment, fighting through 2 false guards who had committed to reaching him, dealing with them efficiently, and then pushing toward Ethan. But Ethan was not where he had been. Kendrick had him. The Chancellor had covered the distance with remarkable speed for a man his age, and his arm was around Ethan's shoulders in a grip that looked like protection from across the hall, and was not. He was moving toward the back passage. The servants' corridor. The route that led out of the palace's eastern side. Brian started forward. Kendrick produced a knife from his coat. 30 feet. 20. The passage door was 10 feet away. Kendrick reached it first. The door opened from the inside before he could push through it. Elara stepped out. She had gone around. Through the service passages, knowing the palace's layout the way she knew every building she had ever needed to move through quickly. Gary had mapped it for her 2 nights ago. She stood between Kendrick and the exit. Both daggers were in her hands. Her cloak was gone. Her dark hair was loose. The crimson of her dress and the silver of the blades and the absolute steadiness of her stance made her look, in the torchlight of that narrow passage, like something painted rather than real. "Let him go," she said. Kendrick looked at her. Then he looked at the knife in his own hand. Then he looked at her 2 daggers. "You're an Omega," he said. Not as an insult. As a disbelief. "You've said that before," Elara said. "People keep saying it as though it settles the question. It doesn't." Ethan, in Kendrick's grip, was watching Elara with a completely specific expression, not fear, not helplessness. The look of someone who has seen this before and is calculating his own role in the next 10 seconds. He stomped, precisely and with considerable commitment, on Kendrick's foot. Kendrick's grip loosened by 3 inches. That was enough. Ethan dropped low, twisted free, and moved aside. Elara moved forward. The rest was fast and quiet and not particularly complicated, because Elara had been practicing knife work against targets that were larger and faster than a middle-aged chancellor since she was 14 years old. She disarmed him cleanly and had him against the passage wall in under 4 seconds. Brian arrived in the doorway 6 seconds after that, breathing hard, sword in hand. He looked at Elara. He looked at Kendrick, disarmed and held firmly in place. He looked at Ethan, who was standing 4 feet away brushing dust from his good clothes with the expression of someone who would like to pretend the last 30 seconds were beneath his dignity. "Excellent," Brian said. "His foot may be broken," Ethan said, somewhat apologetically. "It is fine," Elara said. "He'll live." "I meant his foot," Ethan said. "So did I," said Elara. Brian took Kendrick. Lewis appeared in the doorway behind him, saw the situation was resolved, and leaned against the wall with the satisfied expression of a man who has had a very eventful evening and wouldn't have missed a moment of it. The Chancellor's chambers were searched that night. Gary and Lewis oversaw it personally, and what they found was comprehensive. 3 separate coded ledgers, correspondence with 6 different noble houses, a detailed record of every step of the conspiracy, written in Kendrick's meticulous handwriting, because Kendrick was the kind of man who documented everything, trusting in his own ability to control access rather than the wisdom of not having a paper trail. He had been wrong about that. The motive, when it became clear, was depressingly ordinary. Kendrick had spent 20 years accumulating quiet power. Not the visible kind, not a throne or a title, but the kind that moves through channels. The kind that controls information and access and the timing of decisions. Prince Aldrich had been, before his death, preparing a series of administrative reforms that would have significantly curtailed the advisory council's independent authority. Kendrick had not wanted those reforms, and so he had arranged for Prince Aldrich to not live long enough to implement them. He had not anticipated the child surviving. He had not anticipated Elara. The trial was public, because Brian had learned from watching Kendrick that the things that survive longest are the things no one is afraid to let people see. Every piece of evidence was read into the record. Every ledger, every letter, every financial trail that Gary had followed through those 4 patient days in the archive. Noble houses that had cooperated with Kendrick's schemes were identified. Some were surprised, some were not. All faced consequence calibrated to their individual involvement. Kendrick was stripped of his position, his titles, and his properties, and sentenced to exile in the north, which was a cold, uncomfortable, deeply unglamorous place that Kendrick spent the rest of his life finding entirely appropriate in how poorly it suited him. Several of his allies in the noble class resigned their positions. 2 fled the kingdom ahead of their summons and were allowed to keep going. The laws restricting Omega rights, a substantial number of which, the investigation revealed, had been inserted or strengthened during Kendrick's tenure, quietly and without public attention, were formally reviewed and the majority revoked. It did not fix everything overnight. Nothing fixes everything overnight. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, in Brian's experience, were everything. 3 weeks after the winter assembly, on a night when the first actual warmth of the coming season was beginning to soften the frost on the palace windows, Elara found Brian sitting on the wall of the eastern garden. Not in his throne room. Not at his desk. On a wall, like a man who needed somewhere to sit that was not official. She sat beside him. It was dark. The city below the palace was lit with scattered lamps. The air smelled like cold stone and the very beginning of something green underneath it. "Ethan read 4 books this week," she said. "I know. He told me about all of them. Separately. He is very thorough. He has your tendency to want to communicate everything in complete detail." She glanced at him. "I don't do that. Last Tuesday, you gave me a 12-point summary of the patrol pattern along the eastern wall. It was relevant. It was 11 points more than I needed. The 11th point was the most important one." "I know," he said. "That's why I listened to all 12. A pause. Below them, the city breathed its quiet nighttime breath. "I should leave," she said. "Soon. I don't have a formal role here. I have no title. I have a complicated history and an association with an organization that your court would prefer to forget, and I want you to stay," Brian said. She stopped. "Brian. Not as a courtesy. Not because of what you did for Ethan, though I will be in debt to you for that for the rest of my life." He turned to look at her. "Because the palace is quieter and worse and considerably less interesting when you're not in it. Because you are the only person in this building who tells me what they actually think without waiting to see what I think first. Because Ethan cries less when you're nearby, and that matters to me. And because—" He stopped. He tried again. "Because I have been, for the past 8 weeks, entirely unable to stop thinking about you. And I have tried. Genuinely tried. Lewis can confirm that I tried. because Lewis was there for most of the attempts and found them tremendously entertaining. She was quiet. Then, very softly, she laughed. It was a real laugh, not the small, controlled sounds she usually allowed herself. A real one, unguarded, that changed her face completely. He had been waiting, without knowing it, to hear that sound since the night she sat on the broken wall in Raven Hollow and told him who Ethan was. "I don't know how to do this," she said. And for once the careful, measuring quality was gone from her voice. She sounded younger. "I know how to survive. I know how to protect. I have done both for so long that I'm not entirely sure I know how to do anything else." "Then we'll find out," he said. "Together, if you're willing." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The fated mate pull, that deep, cellular recognition that the old stories described, that Brian had spent most of his adult life assuming was romantic exaggeration, hit him the way it had been hitting him in quiet ways for 8 weeks, except now he was not looking away from it. Neither was she. "Ethan will have opinions about this," she said. "Ethan will have 12 of them," Brian agreed. "Presented in complete detail. I'm going to need you to be patient," she said. "Trust takes time for me. A lot of time. I don't give it quickly, and I take it back fast if it's broken." "I know," he said. "I have been paying attention." She studied him for a long moment. Then she leaned forward, slowly, giving him every opportunity to misunderstand and every opportunity to understand correctly, and she pressed her lips to his. It was brief, careful, precise, in the way she did everything. When she pulled back, the expression on her face was something he had not seen there before, something open and undefended and quietly terrified and entirely, honestly alive. "I'm still not good at this," she said. "You're doing beautifully," he said. She rolled her eyes. But she didn't move away. The formal proceedings took 3 months. Ethan's restoration as heir was complete by the end of the first. His tutors found him several years ahead of where a prince's age should be in some subjects and 2 years behind in others, which he found personally offensive in a way that drove him to remedy the gap with considerable speed. The Omega reform legislation passed in the 2nd month, after considerable debate in the Noble Council, during which Elara sat in the observer gallery and said nothing and somehow managed, through the simple power of being present and visibly unimpressed, to influence the outcome more than 6 formal speeches. Gary noted this with quiet admiration. Lewis noted it loudly and was asked to lower his voice. The matter of Elara's own position was addressed in the 3rd month. Brian proposed formally, in private, in the Eastern Garden where they had sat that night. No ceremony, no court audience, no proclamation. Just him, and her, and the green smell of spring coming through the air. She said yes. She said it the way she did most things, directly, without decoration, and with her full attention on his face to make sure he understood she meant it. She then immediately began telling him 12 things she needed to understand about how the arrangement would work. He listened to all 12. He reminded her, gently, that she had told him she didn't do that. She told him he didn't have to look so pleased about it. He told her he absolutely did. The coronation of Queen Elara of Silver Ridge was, by most accounts, the least traditionally royal ceremony in the kingdom's history. The woman being crowned arrived on foot, wearing a gown that was deep crimson, her own choice, which caused considerable comment among those who expected ceremonial white, and stood at the throne without visible anxiety, and received the crown from the royal elder as though she were receiving something she intended to earn rather than display. Ethan stood to her left in his prince's regalia, looking proud in the way 10-year-olds look proud when they are trying very hard not to let anyone see it. Lewis cried. He denied this afterward and would continue to deny it for the rest of his life. Gary said nothing, but there may have been something around his eyes. And outside the palace, in the city below, the people of Silver Ridge, who had watched an Omega with 2 daggers hold a courtyard against impossible odds and decide a lost prince was worth every cut and every frozen night, made a noise that carried all the way up through the stone walls of the grand hall. It was not a polished sound. It was not ceremonial. It was the sound of people recognizing something true when they saw it.